this is a condensed version of the first segment of the talk that I gave here at St. George Antiochian Orthodox Cathedral. And this is because the very first section was not recorded. There was a malfunction and it did not record. So they asked me to give a brief explanation of what I talked about so that when you listen to sessions 2 and 3, you'll understand the context for what I said. So basically what I was trying to get across in the very first session is to put the people in the audience back to understand what life was like in the time of the early church. When the apostles went out to preach and they met people, either in the synagogues or on the streets, in the marketplace, wherever they happened to meet someone, they had to introduce them to who Jesus was. Jesus was not somebody that anyone had ever heard of. And they talked about Christ, and people came to be followers of Christ based on the testimony, the oral instruction of the apostles. This is how the Christians learned about the faith, and this is basically what we mean by apostolic tradition. So what I try to convey is that these first Christians didn't just learn doctrines, they didn't just learn stories about Christ. What they learned was an entire way of life, which was very different from what they had known before, either as a Jew or as a pagan. Everyone else in the world at this time was either a pagan or a Jew. And pagans worshipped idols, and they had a life of immorality. It was characteristic of the pagan lifestyle to be immoral. And the Jews, on the other hand, they were quite the opposite. They didn't worship idols, but they lived a very strict life of ritual purity according to the law of Moses, Jewish laws, which numbered in the thousands, literally. Christians were neither pagans nor Jews. How did they know what to believe and how to behave? That's part of what the apostles taught those early Christians. They learned not only what to believe and stories about Christ, but how to behave. And this became part of the thinking of those first Christians, the mentality of those first Christians, and this is what we call fronima. So fronima means mind, mindset, mentality. It sometimes can refer to a stance or somebody's worldview. So the first Christians learned the fronima of Christ because that is what the apostles had. How did the apostles know what to teach? Jesus didn't leave anything behind. He didn't leave any writings, just as the apostles didn't go to a new place and leave books or pamphlets or videos or anything else. They had nothing but their oral teaching. Well, the Lord spent 3 years with the apostles, and he shaped them and he formed them, and he tried to teach them not only how to think, but also how to behave. So fronima is not just about the mind or mentality, but it includes our entire way of life. So one of the things we need to recognize is that in the early church, the emphasis was not on writing, but on oral apostolic teaching. And people learned directly from the apostles. So this makes some people uncomfortable because in our times, you see, we rely on writing a lot. We don't have very much strictly oral teaching. So people rely on books, they rely on writing, and for some reason they think that this makes the teaching perhaps more believable, more credible. But in the early church, this was not the case, and it had nothing to do with the fact that they were Christians, but the fact that most people did not use or rely on books. If you went to school in antiquity, you went to school maybe with a wax tablet. If you were learning to write letters, you had a sheet of wax, and people would practice writing letters on this wax tablet. And then they would rub it out. That was basically their way of erasing it. They would write on it with a stencil, a sharp stick. That's it. They didn't go to school with textbooks. They didn't rely on books. They sat on the floor, and their teacher taught them orally, and they learned to listen attentively and to memorize large amounts of information. So oral teaching was the norm, not the exception. And it's not that people couldn't read as much as the fact that books were expensive because they all had to be hand copied. And this was very time consuming, and that's what made the production of a book very expensive. Also, because books were hand copied, the copyist could introduce errors into the book. Either they could intentionally change something they didn't believe in or accept, they could introduce something that wasn't there originally, or they could just make a mistake as they were copying. So people did not rely on writing. And this is something that we need to get used to. So those of us who come from a Christian tradition that says sola scriptura, the Protestants tend to insist that the only thing we can believe is what's in the Bible. Well, the church didn't function that way because books were rare and expensive. People didn't rely on them. And the other thing is that people preferred to learn from a living apostle, somebody who actually knew the Lord. So we have to recognize that the early church functioned without having written proofs of a lot of things. The last reason why the church didn't write everything down and did not rely on documents was because the Christian faith was a mystery. It was something precious. The word mystery or mysterion also just means secret. And the Christian faith was a secret. People were not taught everything. They learned some basic things, but then they didn't learn the true elements of the faith until after they were baptized. So I thought I would share that with you, and that lets you into understanding what the mind of the early church was like, how the early church related to oral traditions and written documents, and then now you can go ahead and listen to session 2 of the presentation.